Kia ora, year 12, so it's Ms. Mac again, and I'm going to try and make this one whole video. I just wanted to make sure it actually fit in the model. I could probably go a little bit better. Oh, whoa, not that big. Okay, halfway point. Yeah, okay, that'll do. All right, so in this video here, I want to cover changes in the demand for labour. So what does it look like? How do you show it? And then what does it do to wages and employment and unemployment levels? So let's start with vaccine workers. Actually, can we go? I don't know. Can we go a bit big? No. Yeah, let's just concentrate on this one here. Okay, so just look here. Again, not so amazing drawings, but you can work with this. You're cool. All right, so if we look at, I chose vaccine researchers because I'm thinking of something topical, and I was like, COVID-19. What's a market where, a labour market where there's probably heaps of demand for like those particular workers' jobs, right? Vaccine. Everybody wants a vaccine. So it's probably a massive increase from vaccine organisations, like scientific bodies, basically, for scientific people who can create a vaccine. Yeah. So what we show here is an increase in the demand for labour. So it's a shift out to the right. Yeah. So shift out to the right. And you need to label it DL1 or something like that to indicate that this was your first demand for labour curve and now it's higher. There's more demand for labour, and you can call it like 1, 2, or 3 or something, just something that indicate that it's a new demand for labour curve and it's out to the right, so it's higher, there's more demand for labour. And an arrow is really good because it shows you the direction of the shift. Yeah, so that's the basic points. Why? Because we need a vaccine, so there's more demand for the people who create them. All right, so the demand for labour increases and there's no change in the supply for labour in this market. And you know, it's probably the type of job where you've got to be like really smart, highly qualified. You know, there's not many people that can probably do that. So the supply for labour hasn't changed. This is technically the full amount of people that you could hire. And what we want to look at is what happens to employment, unemployment. Let's start with the wages. So looking at this, I've drawn W over P to show real wages. So I'm just like, let's look at the real value of wages, not nominal. So W over P stands for real wages. And what we can see is here's our equilibrium point before. Here's the starting situation. Demand for labour is here, supply for labour is here, and that's the current wage. And that's the level of vaccine researchers employed, okay? And that stands for E, the amount that's actually employed, 0 to Q. And then with the demand for labour increasing, like by quite a lot, I did do quite a lot, what we will see is that the wage rate will increase from W over P to W over P1. Again, you can call it something else, but you just need to be clear that the wage rate is increased. So we like an arrow to show like it's increased, and something like a dash or a 2 or something like that to indicate that it's a higher wage at the new equilibrium. Why? Well, think about it. There's more demand for vaccine researchers. The supply hasn't changed, so therefore there'll be more bidding up of wages as they try and secure those limited vaccine researchers to work for them. Yeah, so the wage will go up. All right, there's no minimum wage because I think we can probably understand they're paid a lot more than the minimum wage. Like people who research vaccines are probably paid like, I don't know, like at least hundreds of dollars an hour. Probably they could probably, some of them charge what they like, really. So we don't need to show a minimum wage because it's not relevant to this market. They're paid so far in excess of it that the minimum wage is like, it's down here. Okay, so that's why I haven't shown it. So what we can establish is that demand for labour was to increase in this market, wages would indeed increase. Again, time period probably quite quickly because you know it's really important that we secure a vaccine, so I think that they'll be very quick to offer higher wages in this market. Yeah, so let's have a look at what happens to employment and unemployment. So straight away, with no minimum wage, the only type of unemployment here is what we call voluntary unemployment. If we started our current initial equilibrium position, the amount of voluntary unemployment is between Q and QF, so VU. Yeah, so there's a level of unemployment, but it's voluntary, and E is those who are employed. As the demand for labour increases, some of those people who are voluntarily unemployed will now get a job, so employment will increase from 0 minus Q to 0 minus Q1, so E dash. There'll be increased employment as more vaccine researchers get a job at this higher wage. But the level of voluntary unemployment would decrease because with that higher wage, the opportunity cost of sort of sitting at home and, you know, just finish your science degree or whatever is a lot higher now. So you're prepared to offer your labour, supply it at that much higher wage. So voluntary unemployment would actually decrease from VU to VU dash. Again, it's all about the labelling here, people. Make sure it's really clear, and you can use different labels, but just make sure you maybe have a key here. Okay, I'm talking to you, so I don't need a key, but if it was you, if I was me writing it, I would have like key, and I'd be like E equals E1 equals VU equals VU1 equals. Just lots of labels will help you to show the points we're making. So before we move on to tourism workers, which is a different story, not so great, we're seeing an increase in the demand for labour of vaccine researchers. Again, I'm being really specific to a particular industry. And what we'll see as a result is that wages in this market will increase from W over P to W over P1, right? Because there's no minimum wage. And as a result, there'll be an increase in employment. Well, not as a result, but even though it costs like firms that make vaccines more, they're still really, really wanting to get those workers. So the employment level will increase from E to E1, while the amount of voluntary unemployment in this market will decrease from VU to VU1. And again, the people who are unemployed in this market, we say choose to be unemployed. They're holding out for a higher wage. There is no what we call involuntary unemployment. Yeah, so that doesn't exist in this market. There's no minimum wage. Okay, take a moment, maybe pause and go back over this a couple of times if you need to help you just get your head around what's happening. Okay, let's have a look at tourism workers. A little bit different. Can we just move this over? Yeah, let's just move this over. So you can see I use some different colors here, probably just getting a little bit too ahead of myself. But let's have a look at it. So tourism workers, okay, so generally speaking, your average person who works in tourism, you don't actually necessarily need a specific qualification. There are some, you know, like tour operators, they probably would like you to maybe have studied tourism, or like the actual thing you're looking at, they maybe have a driver's license. So there might be some entry requirements, but they're pretty low for most of the jobs in tourism. You know, there are some things like if you're doing like outdoor adventure type things, it's kind of tourism, probably need to have some experience and maybe some qualifications in the area. But if you're working like in a cafe or like in a visitor centre or something like that, you don't necessarily need a specific qualification, probably like level 2 NCA or something like that. Like, you know, you can read and write, got good math skills, that's important. But there isn't necessarily a high level of, say, entry requirements in terms of being able to work as a tourism worker, as opposed to these guys where, yeah, you've probably got to need to have like, I don't know, some masters in science or something, I don't know. Okay, so let's look at tourism workers. Due to that, wages in the market, if left alone to where supply equals demand, would be quite low. They would be here, right? Okay, so if they were left alone, supply for labour and demand for labour would determine quite a low wage. That's because there's quite a lot of people that could do this job, right? As opposed to these guys, there's not a lot who can actually do that job. So let's look at them. Wages would be quite low. So society, there the government decides there should be a minimum wage in this market, right? So we show that by line across minimum wage, and this is just showing a real wage, W over P minimum. So that's the minimum wage in this market. Again, let's have a look at it. So let's start with supply. Where that line intersects supply of labour is the quantity supplied of labour at that wage, right? So at that wage, that's how many people would be prepared to supply their labour. Now, there's no change to the amount of people who are prepared to work in the industry, okay, at this stage. Like, it's still the same amount of people who would supply it as before. So voluntary unemployment actually stays the same, as that's the sort of like full amount who can work in this market, minus the amount who are prepared to supply their labour at that wage. So VU stands for voluntary unemployment. And since there's no change to the supply of labour, it's the same, there's no change. However, demand for labour has fallen. Yeah, COVID basically is less tourists, yeah, international and domestic now, with Auckland as well being in level 3. So with less tourists, there's less demand for the people who work in that industry, derived demand, yeah, less demand for like tourist activities, so forth, less demand for the people who work there. So the demand for labour has fallen. Now you need to show it shifting inwards to the left, okay, to the left, shift inwards to the left, and then you need to label it accordingly. Again, you don't need to go 1 or dash, you could do a 2, but just make it really clear that you've shifted from here to here, and an arrow is really helpful to show the direction of the shift. Okay, so we shift the demand for labour inwards, we're showing there's less demanded regardless of the wage. Yeah, and then what we see is a move from equilibrium here to here if there was no minimum wage, but there is. So with this minimum wage, this was the quantity demanded of labour before, okay? At that wage, that's how much labour was demanded, and we did have a surplus, and there was involuntary unemployment here, IU. Now that the demand for labour has decreased at that minimum wage, W over P min, this is actually the amount of labour that is demanded at that wage. It's significantly less. Like, that's quite a large decrease. I'm not saying it's that much, but there is a really large decrease in the demand for tourism workers right now. So firms who do tourism have decreased their demand for workers, and so the QDL has decreased from here to here. This is now the new amount of labour demanded in the market. So that actually means that since there's no change in the supply of labour, there's a much bigger surplus from here to here. Before it was just here, and now it's all the way here. Here's your supply of labour, and now here's your demand for labour. That's a massive surplus. So involuntary unemployment has increased from here to here, the gap between here. So IU dash. All right, it's a massive increase in voluntary unemployment. Why? Because you still have the same amount of people prepared to work at that wage, but there's such a massive fall in the amount of demand for labour at that wage that you have a much bigger surplus of workers who are prepared to work at that wage, but there's no demand for their labour. Yeah, so involuntary unemployment increases quite a bit. In terms of employment, well, before we were from 0 to QDL, so there was E, that's how many people were employed. Then COVID hit, and now the amount that's employed in the industry has decreased to there are people employed, but it's much smaller, reflecting the fact that there's less demand, generally speaking, and there's certainly a much bigger fall in the demand for labour at that higher wage. Now, it's really expensive to hire them at that higher wage, and there's less demand for the product they produce, therefore there's going to be less employment. So, bit of a snapshot. I hope that you found this helpful, okay, and I'm going to post it on Moodle. Any questions, see Mr. Moore or myself. Ka kite.